Well, good morning, everyone. Hopefully, you'll understand where we are. Yeah, my slides were not moved too early. So, as you know, today will be a little bit different. So, any questions while we go, please be welcome. Good morning. So happy to see that some people are there. So, when I talked with the demonstrators, as well as based on a lot of student questions, as well as your suggestions, thank you very much for that. There was some. It was helpful to know what people are struggling with. So, how do these web applications work? There seems to be, first of all, some confusion about that. So let's have a look at that. So, first of all, there seems to be a bit of confusion about this whole client-server thing. So, how does a web page work and how does a web application work? So a web page, basically just an HTML file, but normally when you open a web page, you will actually go to open it as from a web server somewhere else, some computer somewhere else, because you don't want to download everything and then only load it. No, you want to see it, what it's currently there. Otherwise, before you can look at the news, you have to first go and use some program to download the news and then open it. That's not nice. We want to go to, say, www.bbc.co.uk/news. And then that opens that, what in web terminology is called a resource. So a resource lives at a particular resource location, and you can find that with a resource locator URL. And what happens if you do that is that your web browser will go and gets the resource that is identified by that location and then reads that and then says, okay, this is HTML. I know what to do with this. I'm going to make the graphical representation of this so that it looks good. Of course, to make it look good, it has CSS as well, and it can even have JavaScript to add more functionality. So if there's JavaScript, it will not only load it, it will also execute that JavaScript. And that's kind of how it fits together. So the web page ties everything together into one document. The web page comes from a web server that provides the web page and the JavaScript and the CSS file, because you normally want them all from the same file. At least the web page tells you where to find the JavaScript and the CSS. And yes, you can also have inline JavaScript, but you don't really want to do that for anything significant. So when we look at it from a web application perspective, what we have is an application that where we actually say, rather than having everything being sent as a web page by the server. By the way, this does not have to be a file. This can be generated by the server on demand. It's a resource. What's underlying that resource? The browser doesn't care. It just says, give me the resource. And then the server provides that resource whatever way it finds appropriate. That can be by giving it a file or by creating the HTML content on the fly. So make sure that you understand that there's a difference between the contents provided and the physical artifact of a file that contains those contents. So yes, a web page is presents a set of contents that link with an HTML file, but it doesn't have to be an HTML file. File has to do with how you store it, but it doesn't have to be stored. It can be generated on the fly. Maybe your browser stores it temporarily in a cache to keep it working. So But still, at some point, you might want to say, okay, I want to actually, rather than going to hit the server and then getting back and then having a refresh, that can get a really jarring experience. Sometimes it's much nicer as if you make some request that it just updates the page then and there. That is what a dynamic page does effectively. It is where JavaScript changes the displayed page. It does this by manipulating the document object, which is according to a standard called the document object model. So there's a standard document object that gives you the web page in JavaScript that you can manipulate however you want. And if you look at your browser's inspection thing, the developer inspection, it will display you the current DOM. What is important to think about this here is that what happens is that your browser receives the web resource. Let's not call it a file, a resource. That resource gets then parsed into HTML or into an in-memory representation, the document object model. That could be either because it can be parsed from HTML or from XHTML, so an XML serialization of HTML, which has some slightly different rules. You can do either. In HTML5, both are allowed, and they have, where possible, the same semantics, same meaning. So this HTML document gets translated into this in-memory representation, and that in-memory representation is the document, or the document object model, the DOM tree, we call it generally, because it is in the structure of a tree, like an HTML document is a tree form, with things nested inside each other. So at some point you have only leaves left. So that is and then what happens then? It's like part of when it does it. It says, oh, hey, here's a CSS file. If you put it in the right location, your browser will pick it up and say, oh, there's your header. Here's a link to a CSS file. Let's add that to the CSS files I need to evaluate in the right way. And also, if it sees JavaScript, it will actually go and try and run that JavaScript, especially if it's in the body. And you can even create HTML directly in your JavaScript code. You don't necessarily want to do it that way by doing document.write. That's a very old-fashioned way because it makes your pages a bit slow, and it disables certain optimizations your browser can do. So that's not necessarily the way you want to do it. Basically, JavaScript is just a bit of a program that you can run in the context of your web page. So it has this document model, it has this CSS, and you can also interrogate the CSS. There's a CSS object model as well that you can access. But if you want to set a CSS file, you can just even set it in the HTML using JavaScript, and that will just make it work. So the browser works from this in-memory document object model, not from whatever file was originally sent over or whatever resource. And this is what a dynamic application kind of uses. Because, so when we look at a page, how can it use JavaScript? So one of the things, the simplest way you use JavaScript is actually just to say, okay, I'm going to add some behavior and make some local things slightly nicer. So if I have a number of drop-down boxes, like a box with countries, and then a box with counties, and a box with cities, you might want to use JavaScript to basically populate that in the right way. So if you select a certain country, and then it might say, okay, this is a state or a county or a province, depending on the country, and then it gives you the actual list of those. Those lists hardly ever change, so you can just pass them along in your web page if you want to, and that makes it nice and responsive. So you don't need to hit the internet again to get that. So that is what we want, what we can do with JavaScript. We can also use it to dynamically load internet resources. Maybe it's not that easy, or maybe you want to go and say, okay, we have a postcode and we want to look up the address. You don't really go and send over all postcodes and all addresses in the UK just because you want that functionality. No, rather you go and get, you just make a request to say, give me the addresses that match this particular postcode. And then it gives you an address, it gives you those addresses. Then when we have this web service, what we effectively have is a web service. You can load static resources that don't change, but you can also do resources. We can even send things or update stuff as the server lives on the internet. So that's how a page uses JavaScript. But so there are also some issues when we are using JavaScript. In particular, from a user's perspective, they don't necessarily need to see that JavaScript execution happens. And there are people around that, well, take advantage of this particular thing, or abuse this, better said. So one of the things that the way, if you look at how browsers work, there's this idea of cookies, where cookies are these little bits of information your browser will send along with a request. So your host sets him and it says, next time you make a request to me, please send this along. That's what a cookie does. That's all it does. So it can contain things like an identifier for who you are or what your login session is, or it can say, okay, I don't want to be advertising tracked, or I want to have a white background. I want the white on black rather than black on white. It can have any kind of things in there. There's a size limit. You can't have it like a whole megabyte full of cookie. That makes your every request a bit slow, but that's what cookies can do. But cookies are linked to hosts, not pages. They are linked to, okay, and to paths within that host. So if a web page makes a request to another host, that would send the page from host A wants to make a request to host B. The browser will look up, okay, what's the host of what are the cookies for host B, and it will send those along, and then it gets the result. So yes, the JavaScript that came from host A cannot see the cookie for host B, but it can still make use of it. Well, except that there are all kinds of browser protections that stop this from happening, including the same origin policy. And when you're using pages, what you need to remember is that by default, you cannot just make requests to other hosts. When we look at regress that you have been using, that one has a special exception set up for itself that basically says, okay, anyone can make requests to us, it doesn't matter. Of course, for that particular website, it doesn't matter because it doesn't actually do anything. It actually returns results that are independent of your request. And there's no state, actually. It's just a testing site. And when I say here, it could go to your bank server, your bank will also have additional security things in place to actually make this not work. Because it's never good to only have one layer of security. You want multiple layers of security. And including saying, okay, but this cookie is not available to JavaScript. Short sessions, so the cookie becomes invalid very quickly, etc., etc. They do all kind of stuff to make it safer. But maybe your bank is not the problem, but maybe your Facebook might be a problem. So there's the same origin policy. In addition, one of the things that you will run so very quickly, if you are going to seriously make web pages, is that in reality, applications don't really work well if you use if you just host them on a normal file. Lots of aspects of JavaScript or HTML of JavaScript, they don't really work well if you don't have a host. That host can be your local host, but many things you need a web server. And make it working from a local file, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. There are many problems with working with local files. So that, beyond the fact that, of course, if you actually want to make anyone else on the internet use your application, they can't look at the files on your local machine anyway. We need a server. So that is why I say make Flask host your files, because Flask is actually a web server. For production use, they don't advise you to use it for files that don't change, but you can. And for our purposes, having Flask as a web application server and then another server for static files is complete overkill. If you have lots and lots of users per second, then it becomes important how you do this and how you minimize resource usage. But for you, that is not an issue whatsoever. So how do applications actually work? How do URLs work, and how do these resource locators work? Because we have a resource that has a location. That is basically, how do you get it? So when we look at resource locators in web parlance, there are actually 4 kinds. There is the URI, the URL, IRI, and the URN. So how do these work? So the URI is a resource identifier. That's the almost top left part, the top kind of thing. This is the base where it started from. So a URI identifies a resource, but resource may not be able to be retrieved electronically. That's the difference between a locator and a name. So a URL locator actually is addressable, that a computer can say, okay, I know how to get there over the internet. But there are also URNs, names, that are not addressable. So, for example, an ISBN number. It is a unified, and it's unique. That is the, if you go and look up, you can find what book that is. Then there is the IRI, basically that is to do with international character sets. So people who use non-Latin characters can still use them in their host names. And what they do is they translate those IRIs into URIs. So the IRIs gets translated and back into URIs. There are some real issues with that, because there are certain letters that look exactly like their Latin equivalents. So there's some issues with, if you have a capital A in your host name or something like that, there you can find a Russian letter that looks exactly like it, but it's a different letter. And then you can do all kind of nasty stuff by people thinking I'm at the right address, and they are not actually at the right address. So, so that's what IRIs are for, but they're not really that relevant. In this case, we are mostly looking at URLs, locators. So URL locators, they have a number of different elements to them. So we have the scheme. So what language does the does the system need to speak? What's the protocol that, or so? What kind of way do you get there? In this case, it's HTTP. You could also have HTTPS, but there are other protocols. Then, so the colon / is kind of not really interesting in this case. And we have the host name. or the host IP address. So it can be either a name or an IP address, IP4 or IP6. And the host name then gets translated by your browser or your operating system into an IP address. And that's where it goes to make the request. But you don't only need to know which computer to go to, you also want to know what port that server is listening, because one computer can have multiple servers listening at the same time. We need to pick that. In this case, the default port for HTTP is 80. So if you don't put any port in there, leave the colon 80 out, it will go to port 80. If you have HTTPS, it will be port 443. It's not necessary to remember that, by the way. But then inside that we have a path part. So that is the, in a way, it looks like the folder of your resource. And it uses slashes, and the slashes are meaningful because of relative URLs. But in many ways, there is no requirements to have folders or anything for the path on the server. That's the convention, and that's how a static file web server normally works. If you go into a static thing, you just go to these paths and then you get your resources. But that's because the web server is implemented in that way. Then we have the option to add a query to a particular resource. Obviously, a query does not work with a static file. A static file has no aspects, but again, the query is kind of, on the service part, it's a convention. It could just say, okay, these different queries are just different files, but that's not how it's intended to work. It's intended to work as parameters to whatever program runs or functionality runs to provide that particular resource given those query parameters. And finally, there's a fragment which identifies a location in a particular resource. So the fragment stays in the browser and will never even go to the web server. Web servers don't care about fragments, but they will receive the query. So when a browser sees a URL, or it knows that something is a URL, then you can do it in two ways. You can use an absolute URL, so like we see here. Absolute URL will provide exactly everything needed, how you need to go, where you need to go. But a relative URL also exists. So a relative URL is based upon some other URL that it uses to kind of give the missing bits. So it will never fill in queries or fragments, by the way. Those are always, they're never filled in. It fills in basically your host name, your scheme, your port, and maybe your path. So you can have a host relative URL if your relative URL starts with a slash and then the resource name that you're looking at. So if you start with a slash, you're going back, it will not look at the local path. If you don't start with a slash or actually a hash or a question mark, then we have a path relative. So what it will do is it will look at the current resource name without any of the question mark or hash bits, and then it goes and it strips everything away until it sees a slash, and then it will use the name it's given and add that instead of the current resource. So this is basically, think of it like getting a resource in the same folder. That's kind of how it works. Obviously, resources and folders don't need to exist. Then we have resource relative. So you can make a request to the same resource if you don't even provide a resource name. You just provide a fragment name or a query. Those will be resolved against the resource So a fragment will just look at the current file and will not even make a web request, a request to the server, because it knows the file. It just goes, okay, I need to move the browser window to scroll it that particular fragment is visible, like your regular HTML. When you make web service requests, fragments don't really matter at all. So when you have an application, what you'd have is your page URL would be the basis for those relative URLs. And if you use those, and because of the same origin policy, we normally make requests to the same server. Yes, there are ways you can make exceptions, and when you send a page, you say, oh, you can also make requests to that server or something like that. You can do that, but in our case, why bother? And so to make it work correctly, you want them all to be hosted through Flask effectively in your assignment. And in addition, you want to use relative URLs so that if you host it on a different server or on a different name or with a different port, everything just keeps on working. And of course, your URLs stay nice and short as well. So use relative URLs to refer to your JavaScript or your CSS or even your resources, because they are just locations of resources on your server. We'll come back to how this works in practice when I'm going to go into PyCharm and have a look at that. We'll do that later. So then before I there was some confusion about HTTP methods I've understood. So GET is the common way. That's what your browser uses by default. It retrieves a resource, and the implicit requirement is that it is valid for a web server to make the request 0 or multiple times. 0 if it can determine from additional data in your headers that the file, that its cache should still be valid. So if you don't, for dynamic pages, it normally adds a little header thing that says, okay, this page cannot be cached. Caching this page is invalid. And that means that the browser will not try to re-download it. Or if it says, okay, I try, it often makes there's another request called head, which is basically like get, except head will not get the contents, it will only get the headers. Why does it do that? So that it can read those headers and say, okay, what has this file been changed since this resource been changed since I cached it? If not, I don't need to download all the contents of this resource. So that makes it faster. And that's all the things that you do with static files fairly easily, and your web server does this all for you, and it speeds up everything a lot. But dynamic resources obviously cannot necessarily be cached. Yes, you can add the caching information in if you want to, if that's relevant in your context, but you need to do that manually, because by default, systems that do dynamic pages assume that caching is invalid, and because they can't know when it's valid or not, because well, it depends on the dynamic behavior actually present. So then there's the post. So post is basically directed to a specific resource, and it provides it with information that can lead to an update of one form or another. What exactly happens is, when we look at the standards, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. So I can have a look at okay, I'll have a look at it in a minute. The URL doesn't want to. If I do this, it should open my browser somehow. Be able to find it there. Let me have a Okay, so let me very quickly do this. Uh, what's the best way of doing it? I will just open it in a tab. So when we look at this, this is the HTML standard. And we can see here the fragment identifier in the top if you browser allows that. So here we have the get method. So the get method gets these resources. The head method, like I said, is identical to get, but it doesn't send the body. The post method, like it says here, it it does this in a way consistent with whatever the meaning. So semantics is just a fancy word. Okay, you can't see the browser. Now you should be able to see it. Well, except now my browser. The page went away. I'm not sure what happened there. It also seems to have reconnected my thing. So I'm gonna very quickly switch my my resource is. So here we say we see this resource. So it's not a file. It is a resource. So and that can be, so it provides a bit of data and then whatever it processes. One of the things is a post may not be automatically be repeated. So yes, you can use it to create a resource, and then you should send the 201 created response, including a location header where the new resource actually has been created. So if you have a list of users and you say post a user to that list, then that can create a new user resource and say, okay, here the user resource has now been created. And then we have the put request. So the put request makes a request to create a resource at or update the resource at a particular location. So it says, this is the contents, put this here. And so basically, like it says here, you need to it needs to result in an equivalent representation. So that means it should be the same content or basically equivalent. So put is there for creating resources in that way. So in many cases, if you have a resource that has an ID and the location is based on that ID, you don't want your users to provide the ID. The server will provide the ID because it knows which IDs are already in use. The client cannot know that. It could very well be that it looked for a free ID. When it tried to create the resource, someone else already came in and used and created another resource with that ID. The server can actually handle that conflict and just find the next unused ID exactly at the point where needed. So that's the put request, and then there is the delete. So there's a lot of specifics on this, as you can see. And the delete request basically says delete this resource. But traditionally, web browsers don't use delete or put at all. There's a few other requests, but we don't really want to go into it. Be careful. The W3 Schools documentation on this is, as many W3 Schools documentations, misleading. Doesn't tell you enough details to actually understand what's going on. It's just confusing. From my perspective, I never ever would recommend anyone to look at W3 Schools. If you want good resources on how something works, use the Mozilla pages. They are much better in quality and accuracy. But in general, the idea between the HTTP methods is put for creating resources, get for reading resources, post for updating resources, and delete for deleting them. Yes, I know many people like W3 Schools. I just don't. I find them misleading. There is a lot of misleading information on W3 Schools. Probably not everything, and I haven't looked too much in the past, but in general the resources are just not good enough. And they are misleading, and I would say misleading is worse than missing information. So I find Mozilla developer website to be very accurate in what it says. Although it can be a little bit harder to access for students, which I can understand W3 Schools provides the simplified version. But sometimes the simplified version is also a wrong version. You need to be very careful with that. Or when you actually want to know what it does, go back to what the standard says. Yes, the standard is a little bit dense. And in the case of Post, it's a lot dense. Some of the information is there for web server implementers rather than for users. But that is the source. If you want to know how HTML elements work or how CSS elements work, the standards are quite readable and they explain exactly what it does. Okay, so that was web server. Then we have a look at some of the suggested topics. So how do we link AJAX request with Python request handlers? So the way we are going to look at that is we're going to look at PyCharm. And let me have a look there. So we go to PyCharm and we can see we have a okay, so in PyCharm. So last lecture I did a little bit with Flask already, but now we need to see how does this actually work with your assignment. So first of all, you were given this user's file, and that user's file I can actually open it as a we can open it in our browser. By the way, is the text readable, or should I make the fonts even bigger? I'll make the font a little bit bigger still. So font, we put it in font size 20. That should make it quite readable for you. So this is the page. It's not very pretty, so the first thing I will go and do, because this is just what I downloaded from what you had, is I'm going to reformat the code for the file. Normally I would use the shortcuts. I use this a lot. And yes, PyCharm, at least the professional version, has support for JavaScript and for HTML. So we can see the page. So yes, I was running Flask at the moment, but let's skip that. So this is the page, and this represents our users. I can show that to you directly, but let's first actually take this file and make it available. So what we need to do this is we first need to put it in our static folder. We just copy it. I hold down the control thing. We copy it there. Let's call this index, or we can call it users.html. It doesn't really matter. We can add it to our version control here. And then we need to tell our application to find it. So what we want to do is we add. So what Flask does, it's basically a way. It has this application object, and given this application object, so yes, you want to probably import all these things to make stuff work, and there's more elements that you can add from Flask. There's extensive documentation on Flask that you might want to have a look at. In any case, so we create a Flask object given the name of this file, and that Flask object can then be used to call these decorators. So these decorators, basically, they do some changes on your function, but in our case, it's not really important how they work. What they do is they tell Flask in its web server that when you run that basically when it receives a request that matches the particular route, it needs to call this particular function. So if it sees a request that starts with the relative, all these are relative URLs, because the host name is something that you get from your operating system, and the port, the same thing. We don't want the web application never works with absolute URLs. It always works with relative URLs, more or less. So, or almost always. So in this case, if we see the request for the resource test.html, we're going to send this static file test.html. How does it find this? Well, the send static file function, so we press Ctrl Q, we get the documentation, and here is the short documentation. We can possibly click on this and that should open a web page. Okay, yes, it opens the web page, but yeah, it's not visible to you. I can show you very quickly. It opens this web page with the API. We're not going to go into the specifics, but in this but that's how it works. Let's go back to PyCharm. Because so Flask has a lot of functions in the app module that can do a lot of these things. In this case, it's a static file. In many cases, you just want a lot of, say, okay, everything in CSS is a static file. So what you can do is you can have this placeholder in your, so this is a convention that Flask uses. If it sees these angle brackets, it will treat those angle brackets as the name of a parameter that needs to receive whatever is there. So in this case, so we basically, this file here matches this file attribute in the, or the file parameter in the function. So when you ask it for a CSS something, slash CSS dot something slash something, it will return that file. So let me have a quick, before we do this, so let's run the Flask actually, because one of the things I can do is just use a terminal command called curl, and then we go and look in our run, and what is our URL? Okay, it's localhost 5000. It uses the IP address, but I know it's a thing, so localhost is slightly easier to type, 5000. And then we can do something like, okay, test.html, and it will return this particular content, which happens to be the content of this file test.html. We can also do something like, okay, give us css / test.css. In this case, it will return this content, which is this particular file. You can see that there's no line end at the end of line 3. There was, so it would basically put this stuff around. Now, if I do this again, it will actually have a new line at the end of the thing. Same with the test.html. So you probably want to do this. That vn bit is just part of the console here that we're using. So if you want to say, okay, if but that CSS, that test.css works because not because it is correct, because yeah, so it says just send the static file.css. We could also create a file so how does this work? We could actually say, okay, we want to get test.html here. That is actually, there's no requirement that what you ask for CSS is actually a CSS file. So this works, as you can see. We don't necessarily want to do that. And you can possibly have things like, okay, if you make this into .css, that it wouldn't do that. I probably need to reload Flask for that to make that work. If I now do the same thing, it says it doesn't exist, but we can still do test.css. No, it doesn't work with test.css. Again, so there are some limitations. So those are the difficulties with working it. So I'm not a Flask expert, so there probably is a way of doing this correctly, or you could do your own check. In this case, one of the common ones is what happens if you just click on this particular URL. You get the default page. So the route for that is just slash. So by currently, what happens if you invoke slash is just, it will just return this just hello application programming principles. It doesn't even return a new line. So this is not an HTML page, and if I by the way, there are also headers being sent alone, so you can actually output that to the standard, to the output, and now we can see the content being outputted, returned. So it says it's content type HTML because Flask by default says it's HTML output. It actually isn't, but we don't know. So it has this Werkzeug server using this Python version, etc. This server information. Content length is 45 bytes, and it uses HTTP1 to respond. Probably because a girl asked for HTTP1. I'm not. So, or because the server says I find it easier to support HTTP1 than a harder version. So how do we then actually make our users HTML work? Well, that's fairly simple now, isn't it? What we want to do is basically want to take this code, send static file, and say, okay, we want to return the static file users.html. When we do this as well, what we want to do is, so we want to make CSS files work. We also might want to make JavaScript files work. So one of the things I'm going to do here is create a CSS directory. I'm creating a new JavaScript directory. It's not mandatory, but it's good standards to sort this stuff up. So we put the CSS file there, move it there. Yes, PyCharm is really powerful, so it can do all this stuff, try and do it nicely. In our case, what we need to do is we basically say, okay, so CSS plus file. So we do make this work. Let's first rerun Flask. and we make another request to the CSS file, and yes, it does work. Great. So now we can actually copy this function. So we just select this and you type Ctrl D and it creates a duplicate. And we just change that into JS. We should give it a different name and a different location. So the name of the function in our case doesn't really matter, but give it something that's useful. So in this case, we want to say, okay, we call this main application, something like that. So this would send users.html. So let's reload it and go back to our terminal and say, okay, now we can actually open the users file. And yes, it works. And I have prepared already the ability to actually display this properly. So this is the way it actually looks on your system. So look. So what you see here is that you have your users, and you can so it will return 6 users, etc. So this is the unstyled version that you have been working on. It's just static content. It doesn't do anything. It gets well, except for the images that it automatically downloads from regress, because that's how it's configured. So this is the starting point. This document obviously is not where we want to stay. So what you want to do is you want to actually go and say, okay, I want to replicate. Well, you wanted to actually get some stuff from regress. So how does regress work? And to do that, I will have a quick look at the regress API, regress web page. And so when we look at this, we see how regress works. And in this case, we see all these APIs. So listing users. So this is how it works. You can also, so this is what it works. If you do page 1, it will return you 1 page, first page, etc. And yes, it adds some advertisement information. So yes, you can. So this is how you get this. But so the idea is that rather than getting the content of your HTML page, so going back to, we use actually this API to get us this content. That content. So this is we have this information about the user. How do we then use this information? So this user, it will even tell us how many pages we have. So we can ask for a single user, this, etc. You could have a user not found, etc. So this is an example API that you might be able to find in reality. So going back to PyCharm, what we have here, what we want to do there is to say, okay, we have our users page that has these table rows. So this is a user. So we basically need to fill in this information from whatever we get from regress. So to make it easy, so I have already done a little bit of preparation work. So what we want to do to start with is we want to create a JavaScript file first. To create a JavaScript file, script, and that should just create ourselves a JavaScript file. And in that so this is where our code is going to live. We need to connect it to our users document. This is just what you have been doing for the last JavaScript exercise. So we create a script document tag and src equals as/script.js. And yes, completion is really cool. Now we can do something in our script. So we start with, say, you can do something like document the stuff that I told you not to do. Document.write app was here. This is valid JavaScript. So when we open the when we go back to the browser thing, it should actually be able to now use this. Let me have a quick look if I can actually interact with it. So when we look at the bottom of the browser, so okay, it didn't add this information. It should do that, but not sure what happened there. Anyway, let's go back to PyCharm. I might just open it in a regular browser page. You know what? I'm just going to do a write log hello. Reload it, then it should certainly work. And then when we look in our inspection, we should be able to see coming up. Document.write is probably the problem here. That's not necessarily valid. So there's something that went wrong here. So let me have a quick look at what users, these users. So let's just use a end tag. This just should it should work correctly. So just do it this way. So yes, now it works. So I think there was something somehow we didn't like the end tag. I don't know why. Now we see application programming principles was here. Yeah, document.write is not necessarily the best approach to do things, but we can see that it does something. What we want to do instead is to actually add some event listeners normally. So you would call something called init page or something like that. There's also a property on your document objects called onload that you can say, okay, when you finish loading, call this function. That's normally the way you do it. But so we can do something like init page. Yes, there is some text already there, but basically I have an example implementation there, so that's where it takes the completion from. So we can still implement it here though, because so what we can do. Sorry. Now we are transitioned into the right thing. There we are. Okay, so how do we get a specific user? That's so that is basically when we go at regress. Yes, you should be able to see this now. Oh no, so you don't see it. So when we go to regress a single user, you make a request to the particular URL with API/users/2. So when we look at, we can copy this data. If we want to implement that in our API, So this is the backend stuff. How do we do this? Well, we can just create def get single user, and the API of that was something like it would take a username, user ID. Yes, so what you'd need to do is we need to give it a root, root API slash users slash and then we have our user ID. And it needs to be a string, obviously. Yeah, we can make it a single quoted string. And now we have a user ID, and then we could return, we need to normally look it up, but let's say return something that is basically this. So return JSONify something that in Python is that particular data. So how do we do that? We create a Python-based dictionary that matches this. So what does this look like? So comma ID colon 2. So it's basically almost the same as JavaScript. So we can put that, we can just copy paste this in, and that should give us a Python object that matches the thing. So when we now restart Flask, we can then say, okay, when we do our request to API, say users to, it will return us this avatar, blah, 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 blah. You can see that the order has now been completely messed up. That's because a dictionary is an order independent structure. But that doesn't matter. So yes, you could also create the text yourself and return the text. In this case, we just do it this way. So yes, so this is how you would implement that. Obviously, you'd want to, in reality, you would want to look up the user from a user's list. So like I did, for example, here. So you can have a user's property. So our user's property here isn't really correct, or doesn't match the res-rec user's property. So what we can do is we comment it out. We just create a new user's property. So, or you can use this also as a way for the users list, obviously. So we say user list is a list of users. So we just take user 2 and we say, can we store this user? We might also have an earlier user. So user 1 so let's say Paul, etc. And so yes, you'd probably have a different avatar, etc. So the actual data here doesn't matter, but now we have a user list, so we can actually return JSONify, or let's look down here. We make this a little bit tidier. We copy basically this one because this function implements the right functionality but not the right API. So with user ID, in this case we are talking about user ID in user list, we call it. And so user list user ID, and then we call it user, and then we just JSONify the user. So we reload Flask now, and we can say, okay, we want to get users 1. It says, oh, missing user. That is something it shouldn't be doing. So yeah, no, so yeah, the IDs are numbers, so it needs to find those. Yes, needs to convert that to int. So perhaps so this particular should work. Or we just do that and dot size count dot count yes, my Python is rusty at best. So we ask if it's smaller than the length, we get the, and no, we don't need to, user int, we get the user, and so reloading Flask, this should work. Then we can get the user, and now we get, yes, we get Janet Weaver with ID too, because what we're using is indices. So we want to make this really nice. We could say, okay, -1. That's the easiest way. Or you could start your IDs with 0. It is nicer if you say, okay, which one has that particular ID, etc. So in this case, so we would possibly even want to remove the ID from it or something like that, but we don't need to. There is a way of just taking getting there's probably a way of finding an element from the list. Look at Python, but do it the easy way. Don't make it too hard on yourself. So this is how you would get a list, single user. Obviously, you can use array slices to get a list of users, to get the first 6, the second 6, etc. But this is the way you would get your API, how you can re-implement the API. You connect that with your JavaScript by doing something like, okay, we call this init page function. We need to implement such an init page, so function init page, where we're going to actually do something. So in this case, we say, okay, let's load our users. Get users for first page. So we might pass the page number. So we need a function get users, obviously. Get users page. So the page that we're looking at. So yes. So how do we do that? We create a function here that will make our request and then send it off. Important here to remember is that in JavaScript requests, they're always what we call asynchronous. They will return immediately, but they will not actually get you the result immediately. Instead, what they do is they will get you the, they will allow you to say, what do I do when it's actually loaded? And so we have a ready state. So what we do in here is we make the request. We pass, in this case, the get method. So some people ask how you do this with post. So you just type in post or put or delete. It's that simple. And then you make the request like that. Or in our case, what we would do is just get rid of this bit and make it work correctly. I didn't implement users, so I will, for testing purposes, probably don't want to do that yet. What I can do is put the code in that we would have wanted. So, and we maybe say, okay, to do. And so that reminds us. So the to do means that when we look here at this task tab, we can actually see there's a to do here. We can see, okay, I want to go. What do I still need to do? So this allows you to put nodes in that are easily findable. But then, and then you call a function to render your users that then interact with your DOM. So I will give you the example implementation of that function. There are some important things to keep in mind. So first of all, this function does not clear your rows. So you need to count how many rows there are. There should only be one because the header row in the table that was provided needs to stay. So you, as long as there's more than one, you just remove a row. So something like while table dot rows is bigger than 1. We do something like table dot remove row 1. We have a quick check that that is the correct way of removing it. Delete row. That's my JavaScript is not perfect. I know well how to program, but the specifics of JavaScript, I don't really do too much in JavaScript. One thing we can do is to say, okay, this is a table. We have the table, so we don't need to get that again. This just tells me how many rows we have. Again, we don't need to really get this. We can just get rid of this. What this does, so now we just put in the original function. What happens is when you load, when you click to the next page, you will delete, call a function that deletes stuff. I want to delete here because then I know that it's always called before I actually render users. So now we want to look at the actual data that we have been passed along from here. So when we received the response, we check that it's in this case 200. So technically, you would probably want to check that it is bigger than or equal to 200, and exit_har.status is smaller than 300, because all codes in the 200 range are valid. Although 200 is the one that you should probably receive. 300 will be a redirect or something like that. Various other codes that you possibly want to handle as well. In any case, normally you just get 200, so don't worry about that. So we parse the thing, we get the users, and then we call the render users with this object. So now in this object, what did that look like? Well, we know what we sent, didn't we? We sent something that has these particular. We get a JavaScript dictionary with these 5 keys. So let's reformat this. Oh, it doesn't want to reformat that. I hope this will work. This should work. But it's Python, so we don't always know exactly how we will want to deal with indentation. Right, so we have these properties. So if we look at the script, what we can see here is that we create ourselves. So how do we know what to create? Well, in users.html, we know exactly what it looks like. In this case, we have the table users, which has these headers, and then we have here things. So this class information is basically something that you can add to a tag so that it will be able to link to your CSS. The default implementation uses the W3 School CSS style. You can use that. There's many other ones. There's Bootstrap. There's piles. I would advise don't make it too complex. Just stick with something that's straightforward for you to understand. Let me have a quick going to put the light on. There's a little bit more light. It's getting really dark outside. So what we have, so we set these different classes, and then you can insert cell. In this case, it says, okay, insert cells. And then for these cells, so it stores the cell that we inserted, and then we put the data in there. And in particular, so as just as inner HTML, you could also have a very big. Instead of having cells, you could just do the inner HTML of the table row and call that with the HTML that you need, whatever you prefer in a way. And then you, so we can say something, okay, what's the page number? We just get whatever page we get out of our data, the total pages we get out of that data. Because as you, if you look at the data returned by request, or request, it will return these properties as well. When we now run this, we shouldn't need to actually reload Flask, but let's just load Flask. That might always make things work slightly better. Let me. Didn't need that one. There we are. When we reload this page, we should now have more data. Or we didn't. How can we test this? We know whether it actually works. So what we just do is we just say, okay, all these rows, we just select them and we comment them out. Okay, we need HTML comments, other kind of comments. I don't know why the other ones are there, but they're not valid. When we look at load it up again, okay, do anything. So why didn't it do anything? Let's go and look in the inspection. It says, okay, that shouldn't really matter. We still, it says app was here, but somehow it gets the old version of the JavaScript. So, okay, because we don't have app was here in here anymore, do we? So it got a cached version. So big challenge is always that we have this cache stuff. So we do stop and rerun, and we sometimes need to also reload it hard. So if you press the equals, then it should work. Now we can see that it is gradually being populated with the data. And you saw it actually being added as we went along. So that is basically how that works. So let's get back to, so now you see how we can actually link that up. Obviously, we would want to do this for our own application. So what you need to do is basically implement the users API. So what was the URL that we were going to place? So API/users/page. You can start with ignoring the page but obviously at some point you want to use this. One thing you want to do is you don't want to put the query string as part of your root. Query string comes as part of your request, so you can get it from the request. And there's some example in here that I think should be somewhere there, somewhere an example that I had, but we can look at it again. So we could create a new root, so root API.users. So you can also add, say it's only there for methods.get, only for a get request. So by default, so you can say which methods does this particular function respond to. And of course you can get from the request what the particular one was. So dev get user list. And we don't take the request, say, so we say, okay, page equals request dot get what was the particular code for that? We'd have to look it up, isn't it? So API, how do we get our request thing? So actually we might want to just go to the overview of the documentation, and we can then say the quick start is something that we can look at. Okay, accessing request data. Guess what? It will tell us how can we get request data. So here is how you can get your post data. Zoom it in. But we can also, you can use a there's where we are. So we can get the particular form data that we are being passed. So in this case, form will get both the data that's okay, we need the method attribute for a guest attribute, and if it's a post or a put, you can get it through form. Okay. We know how to deal with that now. So we need the dot method, and that was it, wasn't it? Yes, it's the no, the request method or request.args. Sorry, I didn't read it carefully. This request.args. So let's get back to PyCharm then, because method, that's naming is very important. And then we should be able to just get the argument page or something like that. Let me have a quick look at regress what the page argument was. So we get is, so yes, it is just called page. Okay, we know how to deal with that. In the right space, so it's page, so the page number. And what we can then do is basically we return, so basically in our case we want to kind of return the right kind of data. So in our case what we need to return is, so we're not doing the paging at this point. The paging will leave as an exercise for you, but we can return some data. So we need to look back at what is the data we actually need to provide. And we can just go out and create a comment that where we are going to store that so that we can see what the data is that we need. So we have list users, so we have the data property, we have the and we have these properties. So we need to have these properties, let's copy them into PyCharm. That we can then use to return this result. So we just select all this stuff and we just Control/ will comment it all out for us. We can look at what it is. So we need to call, we probably want to do something like, okay, we return. We need the per page property. Per page. Let's just cheat here. User, so len user list, comma. So total is the same length of the user list. Then we need total pages. And that one would be 1 in our case, because we don't have paging yet, but we want everything else to work. So, and then we can return, and we now need our, so our data, which just happens to be exactly the format a user list has. So we just put in user list. Now, when we have this, we can, we want to be able to then get our user list not from regress, but from our page itself. So in this case, now we comment this one out and we do the other one. So we have the different URL where we can then get our data from our thing. So yes, I'll try to break down the lecture into parts, but not as fast. Okay, there is an error here. Okay, yeah, oh yeah. There is an error in my code. Where is it? This one we need to get rid of. That's probably not going to be happy. Let's see if that works again. The Python is very finicky. Okay, doesn't like that either. What if we comment this out? So yeah, so it is that function. Okay, let's uncomment that. So we have this root API. Oh, okay, I think no. Yes, the root bit. So perhaps if I first put this one here, then it would work. Otherwise, we'd need to have a function that just dispatches it broadly. So what happens? So it's probably the root that was, yes. So it is, the problem is that this one doesn't do, so the user ID could be not present. So okay, what we are going to do then is if user ID, so len equals 0, then return get user list. For now, and then we remove the root. This should work. It's a bit of a hack. And now when we go and get the users, okay, it can't find. Oh yes, because we need. We run it again. Okay, I'm not sure what is so users 1. So this one works. So I don't know what's the reason why this one doesn't work. Let's call it users 2 for now, and then let's skip debugging that because we are just going to run out of time. So it's not that. Let's. It is something that goes wrong here. This one we could return. So are we complete here? There is it. Where does it? Okay. Oh, the method bit is the problem. So the yes, typos are always cool. Methods equals. That should be it. Yes, reading the error message is very important, even though it kind of hides away lots of crap. Now we should be able to get users. It says we can't understand it. That's a cool one. Probably because I didn't pass a page. Users page equals 1. Yes, there we are. So it creates an error when we don't pass a page. Not something you would normally you would want to test, is there a page property, and if there isn't, you do something, you just have it be 1. So now we get this data. We see how this works. We should also be able to load it in our web page, and then treat that as the completion of our exercise. Okay, we need to reload it properly. There we are. We have our 2 results that I added. You can see now it works. Same functionality, a different place where you get the data. So that's how that works. So let's get back to the actual lecture slides. Yeah, so before I go there is one part that I also still want to highlight, which is the assignment brief. So quick look at the assignment. So the assignment brief. So be careful. Remember that when you look at the assignment, this is all that is technically required. So when we are going to mark this, we are going to look at these things. So there are all these features that you get test for implementing it. Yes, for displaying the list of user use paging. Use array slices for it, and then put some nice way of using your IDs. You can also get the first X elements or something like that from your list. If you store it as a list, it's fairly easy to get a slice. You have been doing that in your exercises. So the backend, so basically is there to have these functionalities related to the front end. So we have kind of sort of some implementation, get single users and get list users. That's how you go about that. The styling, yes, you can use your own one. You can. So there is this professional approach. So there is the bit about the journal. The journal is also about your exercises. And yes, these exercises do help you with your assignment. If you didn't do them, you'd better at least have a look through them to make sure that you didn't miss anything. So yes, So yeah, there's no more Viva as you surmised, hopefully you. So we need your zip with all your application code. So one of the things to remember is when we look at this, the backend does not require a database. A good way of looking at and there are some bits where say, why are we doing certain things in a certain way? But that's because we need to assess these learning outcomes. So we need to make sure that we measure somehow that you can work with multiple languages. That's why we have Python for the backend and JavaScript for the front end. HTML and CSS, are they programming languages? Not necessarily. But JavaScript and Python are certainly. Then, so yes, doing it in a correct way is always important. Not only because, let's say, the reason is never because it makes you look professional. No, why do professionals do this? Because it makes your code better. Ethical means that you actually have something that will actually follow not only the current law but the new laws as well. Graphical interface, you have your JavaScript application, etc. So for questions, again, like I put in the notes, the announcement yesterday, if there's a question questions that can benefit some other students, Piazza is a very good way of asking those questions. If you want to know what's the rules of the assignment, use Piazza, because then we can answer those questions in a way that other students can just read these answers. It means we give you better answers, and we also get to scale our effort in a better way, so we can spend more time on helping students for the individual problems that they have. Like if it doesn't work, like the bugs I had here. Okay, why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it work? We help you with those errors. Experience really helps with that. And try not to use emails or private messages on Teams. We do, of course, if we say, okay, yeah, contact me on private on Teams, that's fine. But if you just have a regular question, try to use Teams. And if you want Teams, another issue, try to be clear in your questions. I see a lot of questions like, I have a problem with my backend. That doesn't really help us to know what the problem is or where you have a problem. It also doesn't help us to have an estimate of how long it will take to answer you. We have a short question with a short answer that satisfies you, obviously, that helps you. That makes it easier for us to actually be able to quickly go in and, okay, I know I have a quick answer to that question. Whereas if a student says, can you help? I need someone to help me with a question. We don't know if it will take 5 minutes or an hour. Sometimes I go and have a quick look and say, okay, I have 5 minutes, but I don't have an hour. Especially for people that are not taking the particular time. And use the @app tag in the virtual P201 so that the demonstrators on app get notified that there is a message. So if they are not looking at it, they will still see the notification. Then an important part of the brief, so the help and support is standard. An important part of that is the marking criteria. This is what we are going to be using. And when we look at this, you can see that there is 10% of the marks goes to the styling. So do you follow the principles? And within those range, then we can say, okay, so what this says, okay, you follow 3 PARC principles and you applied it effectively. But within those range, there is a qualitative difference. So do you do it well or marginally? That is where the difference between, say, 65 and an 80 lives. Same with the other criteria. So there is some degree of quality part in the criterion as well, but also how many elements of functionality did you implement? This is, so it says indicative here. indicative means that if you kind of things like, okay, I don't have a front end, or I don't have a back end, or I basically, you didn't have, if you don't have a front end, there's no CSS. We can't mark your CSS because there's no front end. At that point, we can say, okay, yeah, well, we need to give it a fair mark, but for the vast majority of assignments, we expect you to read us to follow this exactly. Certainly the breakdown and the marking, the ranges. So this is very good, helpful for you to understand where do you actually get marks for. A lot of questions like, can I use SQL? Can I use this? Can I use that? Yes, you can, but be aware that the marks that you get for that are going to be in the qualitative range. Oh, you did some extra features. Yes, you get a bit of extra marks. But make sure first that you actually have your functionality elements implemented, because they are going to be a leading point in the marks. So spend your effort wisely in relation to where you can actually get marks. So that's the assignment brief. Now we can have a look at the lecture, the suggestions that we have seen. We have a quick. So looking at these assignments. So how do we implement data to an HTML table? I've shown you that. SQL implementation in Python. So how do you do SQL with Python? Doing SQL with Python is not required. I would say if you want to do that, look at, so there are ways of doing that, but don't use an actual database server. That is going to be causing lots of headaches with actually marking it, for example. If you want to use SQL, use something like SQLite. That is a local database. But if you do SQL, you're getting a lot more complexity. If you want to store your state, which again you don't have to, you can use files, as there are the lecture slides that you can use, but again it's not required. Node.js. So what is Node.js? Node.js is a web server written in JavaScript. So yes, we won't be using that for this particular unit, obviously, because we're using Python. Personally, I don't like the whole idea of Node.js. JavaScript is a language that is that works reasonably well for small scripting environments, but it is a very forgiving language that doesn't really have the tools to have a compiler check that your code is correct. So, and it certainly has also speed limitations. So personally, I don't like it as a server. Doesn't matter. But and so Node.js is running JavaScript on a server. How you use it, I'm not an expert in it at all. I don't like it. I've never used it really. So I can't cover that in the lecture. It's kind of off topic as well. The advantage is, yes, you can use the same language as the front end of the back end. There's other ways you can do that with other languages that then compile into JavaScript. So jQuery, yes, so I'm not a jQuery expert. jQuery is a tool that can make certain, so it's a library that wraps around certain ways of accessing stuff. You're allowed to use it, don't have to use it. There are things that are slightly different. For this assignment, I would say jQuery is overkill. jQuery and similar libraries, they become really powerful at the point where you want to support many different browsers, including very old ones. Old browsers don't necessarily support all functionality that new ones do, and jQuery is a library that can kind of paper over that difference and make it all work the same. So interaction with the front end. So I showed you how to do this in a basic form, but have a look at the Flask documentation as well. If you want to know exactly how to specify your routes, etc., you can look at that documentation. Yes, it's a little bit much sometimes, but you look at the right thing. And reading documentation is actually an important programming skill. How to use Flask, how to create a Python backend. We kind of covered that. Okay, I didn't cover here how to create the Flask application. Yes, the easy way is to use PyCharm for it. There's some guidance online already how to do that. Some videos. I would say PyCharm Professional is free. You can get you can freely apply with your university email for a year-long license to it. So so how do we? So yeah, I'll come back to the questions later. I'll do look at that. All of programming. Yes, I can't really cover all of programming, but one thing I would like to stress with programming. Programming is a thinking skill, and especially as a beginning programmer, what you want to do, you almost want to skip the computer for the first step and say, okay, what do I actually need to do here? What is the functionality I want? And only later link that to how can I actually make that work in this particular language, whether it be JavaScript, Java, or Python. So think about what you need to happen and then think about how it happens. An important part with that as well is the idea of variables. Variables store data, but they are not values. So we have values which are data, and variables are a way of storing that data. And of course, and retrieving that data, because variables have a name that you can then use to get the data that was in that variable, or a parameter. So variables and values. So the relevant Flask task we need. So here's basically the last exercise on so Flask that you basically want to start with. So Python exercises, and then the last week I talked about Flask. I would say there is no separate Flask exercise, but you have some starting point. You can look at the slides or at the video, how it works, and try and look at, okay, yes, I can do this myself. What does need to be done to the assignment? Well, the brief exactly tells you that you need to implement these features. So how do you do that? Well, you start with one and then you gradually move to the next ones. You can first stick with the regress API until you have the backend API implemented. You can do first the front end, as you did with the last JavaScript exercise, where you already created the front end. I recreated a little bit here, but you should already have that front end as part of your exercise. And now we need to replace ResRec with the actual backend by basically replicating what regress does, or ResRec does, in your backend, as I showed you an example before. The checklist is the features that are in your assignment brief. So yes, so this is more an observation. It's not really a suggestion. I can't really teach this, but yes, I am aware that there's a big difference between students who haven't done things before and who have. And that is a big challenge. And I've seen some questions from people that say, okay, yeah, certainly they know what they're doing. If you're lost, then you are not going to ask, how can I use SQL in this? So how do you get started if you're not doing this step by step, and make sure you not only have done the exercises, but understand the exercises? A big mistake I see many students make with doing their programming is that they try to actually see what does the code, but just copy pasting code without trying to understanding it. Very important is that you understand what is going on, and one of the ways you do that is by playing around with it. So what happens if I change this? What happens if I change that? What happens if I change that? By doing that and by experimenting with your code, you get to learn it better. So what are the topics relevant to the assignment? Well, how do you write Python? How do you write JavaScript? How do you make your JavaScript actually make requests? How do you update your HTML? So that's what the exercises were for. The exercises were really an exercise in learning how to make your application work. So, and then the data comes from the browser, etc. So, how to put a put request? Well, like I said, you just put in where it says get. But updating a current bit of data, that should be a post request. Normally. You can also say, so it can be a post request on the user. A put would be something like we said, we would need an equivalent representation. So you need to put, so if you want to say, okay, I want to just change the username, you say post username equals, well, so you put a post request where the post has username as a parameter and put that as the data. Or you can return use a put with the entire new replacement data. A post can have only the change data, whereas a put needs to have the full replacement data. So why are we using Flask? So part of the purpose of Flask is those ILOs. We have 4 ILOs, and including the one that says we must have you multiple languages. That's the contract that we have with your code. So we need to meet that. That's what the unit is, the unit specification, and we teach that we need to meet that specification. How do you use it without PyCharm? So PyCharm is an editor. It's a very, very powerful editor, and it has all kind of nice ways to make developing Flask, etc. easier. But you can just run Flask from the command line to run your application. There is some guidance available, and if you get stuck, ask in Virtual P201, but most of you should already have figured that out. So important thing is whatever you develop in PyCharm can still be run from the command line or in other ways. PyCharm is just a very powerful editor. It doesn't run your code, it just allows you to edit it. And yes, it has a run button that calls Python to run it. So it remembers and it knows how to put the right command line arguments together, but it isn't your code. So Flask in depth. So the way we set up the assignment is that we actually want you to use Flask as little as possible, basically. So we need to make those requests, make it work, but you don't need to go into the depth of Flask. You need to be able to get your data from your request, and that's about it almost. And your routing. So the Backend API section, I've covered that a little bit. So how to use the XML HTTP request. Well, you pass in the URL that you need to use, and then and you tell it what method you have, and then when it you tell it what it needs, what function it needs to perform when it finishes. How to get Flask and Java working together, I've covered that as well. The whole assignment piece, I'm really struggling with it. So yes, for those kind of things, try to really understand what we've been talking about. Make sure you understand the components. If necessary, go back to the lectures on that. How does HTML work? How does CSS work? How does simple JavaScript work? And if there's unclear things, you can ask a quick question, get it answered quickly. But I have no idea where to start. That's a hard one to answer. How do you start off? How to create the API and integrate it? Well, you start with the first function that calls regress and replace that, and then you just work through your JavaScript and replace all the bits of regress by Python by first implementing that in Python, and then making sure that it works by calling it from the JavaScript API. Just from top to bottom. That's the way I would do it. So and created. So yes, this is already in the examples. Yes, so working it together. I hopefully show that it's not in PowerPoint though. So then we are going to the actual questions. I can run over a little bit if necessary. So the first question was how do you the JavaScript URL and how you have passed in the variable. So how I imagine that this means how do we get the JavaScript? So in here, how do we get the page number, for example? In this case, so I made a mistake in here. This should just call page number. So you store in your first of all, remember that you can have properties in JavaScript where you just store things that are invisible to your user. So this relative URL where we just take, okay, we take the page number, we transform it into a string, and we put it together into a URL. This is how you get your URL where you're going to make your request. Page number comes as a parameter. Where does parameter come from? Here in this case we just pass it the parameter 1. And then we get, so when we start the thing we call get users. So in init page, in the final version, you'd probably also want to initialize the user thing. Probably also want to have some object that stores the state of your application, like which page you're on, which user you're displaying, etc. There's different ways in which you can do that. But you don't need to have visual things to be able to do that. You don't need to store it in your document object model. You can just store it in as a variable. You can just something like, okay, do something like dev current page equals 1. Okay. What is it complaining about? Current page equals. This would work. Let. Oh yeah, so let or var. Var is the one in JavaScript. Yes, sorry, I get confused with. So we can create a current variable, or we can just do it this way, and everything can be. This becomes accessible from the entire script. So we can we can update page number and then just load that current page instead. So that's how you would be doing that. So you want, and then if you want to go to the next page, well, you get users page number 2. So in the button that handles go to the next page, you look at what the current page is and go to the next one. Or if you say, okay, I want to go page 2, well, you say, okay, which page do I need to go? Oh, page 2, get users page number 2. So you call this function with 2 or 3 or whatever as your parameter. So that's how that works. Are there any other questions at this point? Any other questions? Oh yeah, pagination. Yes, yes. Sorry about, I forgot that one. It was asked already. Pagination. So the proper way of doing pagination is to use Python. In particular, our API expects that so it is expected that, say, if we want to mirror the regress API, you have to do it with Python. So just use slices, array slices. You can say, okay, give me element 1 to 6. or whatever. So it's fairly simple to get an array slice. What you need to do is something like something along the lines of, so where we have the API.users, so we want to do something like, okay, user slice equals users, and then we basically do something like 6 colon 6 6 colon 12 should be working. My slices are a bit rusty, sorry, but we use array. We can use array slices to get these. So, and this can be variable. So say page no times 6, page, and then we do page no plus 1 times 6 minus 1, and then we should be able to get the amount of per page would then be 6. And what is the total pages, which is basically so then user list plus 5 divided by 6. Why do I do plus 5? Because I need a round up. If I have got 7 users, I need 2 pages. So 7 plus 5 equals 12, divided by 6 equals 2. All the way up till we have, whereas if we have 12 users exactly, plus 5 equals 17, divided by 6 is 2 point something. This is integer division, so we just drop the point something and we still have 2. But this is how it would work. So don't get me down on the exact slicing index, because I forgot exactly what the parameters are for that. So, but this is how you can do a slice of a list. Look at the slide set for that. And I don't use Python too much, but this is how you would do it. Fairly simple. Obviously, we would return the user slice in this. And one thing I didn't implement here, and you do need to implement, and that's also for everything, is error checking. Check that we get. So if I'm asking for page 2 and there's no page 2, you need to do something about that. You don't necessarily want to crash. You might want to return something else. Or see what restrec returns in that particular case. So you do want to handle this properly. And make this work. Any other question? There's about 8 seconds delay between you seeing it and I saying it. So we need to deal with that. Okay. Hopefully it's helpful for you. See you next week. Next week probably be a general Q&A session. I don't think there's much benefit in going into SQL or something like that. To see where we are with the assignment. Okay. So if there's nothing else, I will end it here. And yes, I'll try to create an edited version. I'm not sure how much slicing is appropriate, but where I can slice, I will.